So I think my main concern after our conversation was, is my way of going about it actually healing, or am I masking something? I think that was my biggest fear, or more so concern. So I started looking at research about it, and there's a couple different modes of therapy. For instance, and they compare all these to medication. Cognitive therapy is probably more similar to what I do, which is a fancy name for saying getting to the core belief of an emotion. It was revolutionary, I think, in the 1980s because it pre-assumed that every emotion that somebody feels is a result of a preconscious thought. And that's what I've found to be true in my experience. But the way that you describe things seems more indicative of mindfulness therapy, which is similarly effective. It's not any more or any less. So I think the answer became for me in looking at the research. They would compare people who had success with mindfulness therapy, and all these things that I was looking at were centered around therapy for depression because it's one of the hardest emotions to move, and it's really tied in with terror because you're terrorized into being motionless. That's what depression kind of is. But with the studies that they were doing, they were finding that people who never experienced depression, they would induce an artificial state of depression through sad music or having them read sad literature. And then what would happen after that is they would notice that the person, they wouldn't ruminate on it for long, which is a word that basically just means chew it. They wouldn't dwell in it for long. And so they wouldn't experience depressive states. They might experience a drop in mood, but not a depressive state. Whereas somebody who is prone to depression, they would experience a drop in mood, but then cycling through depressive cycles of thinking that they have already established. So just belief structures and negative perceptions and modes of just perceiving their own history and things like that. People who, in medication, for instance, it only has, after 24 months, there's a 20% chance of them not relapsing into depression, whereas cognitive therapy has an 80% chance of them not relapsing into depression. So it seems to be pretty effective. It could always be better, but it really depends on how willing the person is, and there's other beliefs that coincide with that kind of experience. When you are belief digging, you might have a belief that it's not that easy to change, that, oh, it can't be this easy, this is all I've ever known, or you go back to it because it's comfortable. But I think it is pretty reliable, and mindfulness therapy has a similar success rate. But they're seemingly different. But what they noticed in the people who never experienced depressive states, they wouldn't ruminate on it. But people who recovered from cognitive therapy or mindfulness therapy, they wouldn't uh, they wouldn't ruminate on it either. Whereas people who were prone to depressive states or people who were already in depressive states will ruminate on it. And that was the only deciding factor on whether the emotion would increase in negativity and perpetuate a cycle. People who experienced cognitive therapy and recovered with cognitive therapy, they wouldn't not have those negative cycles of thoughts. Their relationship with those thoughts was just not energized. The thoughts would not have any gravity to them. So their relationship with them was as just thoughts. They became retired to the role of observer. And it's the same in mindfulness therapy. When somebody's being mindful of it, and I notice that too with beliefs that I have changed. The thoughts may come up, but it'll just be one-off thought, and I look at it, and then it doesn't mean anything to me, and I don't think much of it. I don't give it volition, but, and for mindfulness therapy, it's focusing on the present moment, which I understand, and I do that sometimes, actually a lot of the time. But the deciding factor was they were not ruminating on it. when I understood that, I was able to kind of backtrack into why right use of will didn't seem to work that well for me. When I did it, and I know that they said this a few times, to retire to the role of observer while you're giving it volition, the way I interpreted it, it felt like a secondary, uh, like a just like a secondary point. And at this time, that before right use of will, that's how I was exploring emotions. I would just be mindful of the present moment. But when I read right use of will, I was under the impression that I was bypassing somehow, or I was in denial by not focusing and dwelling into the emotion. What I experienced was rumination. I can kind of backtrack and say that I apparently was ruminating in it because it increased depressive states rather than actually healing them. And you look at different modalities, and they're not very different at the mechanics of what makes them work. Right use of will probably was just misinterpreted by me, and into, because I focused more on giving it volition, and I was observing it. I wasn't, it's a spectrum. I was observing it, but I wasn't fully retired to the role of observer because I was trying to make sure I was giving it volition. So part of me was identified with the emotion while I was in split-mindedness of giving it volition. And it was effortful to give it volition. I wasn't used to that either. But in my experience, it just increased it. It just ruminated with it. That's not to say that that's anything against right use of will. That's how I perceived it. That's how I interpreted it. That's how I experienced practicing it. In different modalities, like if you look at how Bashar explains emotions, he is explaining them in a very similar mode of cognitive therapy, where it's not, you use the emotion as a footstool to get to the sponsoring thought that is producing the emotion. The emotion is an effect of thought. It's the effect of your will filtering through a thought. And that's what the gradation of emotion is sensory felt like. But in ACIM too, is very, by definition, rumination is focusing on the problem and cycles of focusing on the problem under the false guise that you're learning something new about the emotion and that you're going to heal it. And that's factually wrong. Studies show that actually you experience mild retardation and less problem-solving ability under the false guise that you're gaining some kind of insight into the emotion by ruminating into it. But the exact opposite of that is very similar to ACIM, where it says, I don't will for the problem. I want to focus on the solution. I want the answer. So, and all these modalities are seemingly different, and my confusion was they were seemingly at odds. Even the observing it, I felt skeptical of it. I felt like, is observing it actually me disassociating with it in a negative way? Is just observing it, is being above the battlefield, is that disassociating from my will? And actually it's not. In right use of will, I remember they have a section, not a whole section, but it might have been just like a one-off sentence where they say, we only experience physical death because of our own denials. So, how I relate to that is, you look at the Dzogchen tradition in Buddhism. That's the rainbow body tradition. There's other kinds of body disappearing traditions too. Jesus didn't exactly rainbow body. There's a different tradition for that, but for what he did. But the rainbow body tradition is where their body dissolves in light, a rainbow light. But the other tradition is when their body just dissolves in white light. But for them to experience that, you can pre-assume that they had no denials. Well, their core practice is observing, Even Padmasambhava, the person who started Tibetan Buddhism, or brought Buddhism to Tibet at least, and he said that he compared it to a peacock. In the beginning stages of practice, you push away negative emotions, but when you become an advanced practitioner, you become like a peacock who can feed off of poisonous plants and thrive. So you experience those negative emotions and they become beneficial to you. And the way that they do that is by observing them, just observing them. And it supposedly heals the emotional body, and you disidentify from it when you do that. But what happens is it's not you disidentifying from your emotions. You're actually retracting your emotions from the thought. That's what disidentification is. You're not denying your will, you're taking back your will. So it's a slight difference, but a big difference at the same time. So that's my realization with right use of will. I plan to revisit it at some point, but it's not that pertinent for me. I just needed to, I guess what our conversation did, I had a little bit of doubt on how I was approaching things. And I wasn't aware of this doubt until having the conversation. So it did me a good thing. And I got a lot of insight into the mechanics of how different modalities work. And all of them are different permission slips. There is no one above the other. Like anything, it's individuated. There's a million different traditions, but they're all the same instructions at the very mechanical, fundamental level. Even like something like Abraham Hicks, where I had a little bit of repulsion from, her advice was always, if you experience something, negative emotion, focus on something you like. And to me, I was like, is that denial? Isn't that denial? Well, I don't think that it is at this point. I think that what it is, it's just not rumination. It's just derumination. You're not denying that you had it. You're not intellectualizing it and saying that it's not there. You're saying, this is there. I'm focusing on this. And that's not denial. In fact, it is proven to make you more effective at solving that problem by not ruminating on it. Because you're not able to be above the battlefield with it. Focus on something else. And being above the battlefield is, in a sense, derumination. Focusing on the present moment is derumination. It's all just different modalities for derumination. Focusing on the sponsoring thought behind the emotion is derumination. So that's my answer. That's my, that's as clear as I can get on the answer.